Does the Bible contain parallels and borrowings from ancient non-Christian myths and texts? If so, does that make the Bible pagan? Find out on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Today, we will look at the entire issue of the Bible borrowing from non-biblical sources. This is a question that we get on our channel frequently because our channel's content focus is on the ancient Near East and the context of the Bible. On our live stream number 185, we received this question once again. Why don't modern believers consider ancient origins and parallels of their religions? This is something I'm struggling with, and I want to believe, but with this history of religion, it's hard. Now, we understand that this topic is confusing to many and is, in several respects, a failure of our churches to adequately teach the Bible in its historical context. As such, much of the confusion that surrounds this issue revolves around matters of unclear language, woolly thinking, or lack of nuance. So what we're going to do is we're going to break the issue down, and we're going to start to do this by defining some terms. Now, because terms are easily muddled in this conversation, it's important that we properly define what we are talking about to avoid confusion. And we should note that these are not general definitions, but are specific to the discussion at hand. And we're going to define 4 terms. Number 1, a parallel. A biblical parallel is an observation where a similarity is observed between the Bible and a non-biblical source, irrespective of origin, influence, or contemporaneity to the source. For example, one can note parallels between the Bible and Shakespeare, but Shakespeare had no influence upon the writing of the Bible. The second term is intertextuality. This occurs when one text influences another text, either by borrowing or interaction. Number 3, borrowing. This is when a text is appropriated from another author and then repurposed. It should be noted that this is a preferred term over, say, plagiarism, as the latter term presumes intellectual property rights that are anachronistic to the ancient world. Borrowing occurs frequently when a text is being interacted with or critiqued. And the final term is pagan or paganism. This is a determination or judgment call, as opposed to a neutral observation. It refers to people or a religion that is polytheistic in nature or outlook. Okay, so with those basic terms defined, we will now turn to the core issue, which is that if the Bible contains parallels to non-biblical sources, does that make the Bible itself pagan? Now, there's been an unspoken dogma in churches that pagan sources are inherently evil. Therefore, the Bible cannot contain things that are from pagan sources. Thus, the content of the Bible must be directly from the lips of God Himself. This has created a false dichotomy, where either the Bible is all directly de novo writing, that is, writing without any prior antecedents or references, or the Bible is pagan, without there being any middle ground position. Unfortunately, mythicists have doubled down upon this false dichotomy, and have, as a result, presented straw men and caricatures of the sometimes admittedly unnuanced apologetic responses to the false dichotomy. Even worse is that some apologists have failed to recognize this problem in reasoning and have instead tried to present justifications for the false dichotomy. Now, there have been 3 common apologetic responses to the false dichotomy that have tried to explain parallels in the Bible to non-biblical sources. And to be blunt, there are elements of truth to each of these explanations, but each explanation is vulnerable to being torn out of context, because no one explanation covers all the parallels. So we'll just briefly go over through each of these three common explanations. Number one, parallels do not exist, also known as the false parallel position. Now, the first common explanation of parallels is essentially the false parallel position. It is the position that there are no actual parallels to non-biblical sources. Parallels found in the Bible either don't exist, are illusory or cosmetic, or the ancient sources are being misunderstood. While some apologists maintain that in the Bible, there are absolutely no parallels to non-biblical sources at all, that is really not a sustainable position, since parallels by their nature are observations, not determinations. So not all parallels can be dismissed out of hand. Yet, there are some claimed parallels that are indeed false parallels. For example, the claim that the virgin birth of Christ was copied from the virgin birth of Horus is a false parallel. This claim originates with a misunderstanding of the ancient Egyptian sources. Anyone who understands the Osiris myth knows Horus was not a virgin conception, but the result of a copulation with the corpse of Osiris. Number two, parallels are plants from Satan. The next common explanation is that paganism was seeded with Jewish and Christian notions that were inserted into these pagan religions in order to deceive people prior to and following the advent of Christianity. This was a misreading of John 10:8. Quote, "All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them." End quote. Now, the idea is that Satan influenced pagan religions to rob from the flock of true believers. Essentially, Satan is said to have included aspects of truth into pagan religions to lure people away from God. This theory was popularized by C.S. Lewis. Now, when looking at this explanation, there are some aspects about it that are worthy of note. A, the explanation does not deny, but accepts there are parallels in non-biblical sources. B, it accepts that some of those parallels predate Christianity. And C, some of those parallels reflect eternal, timeless truths. But Satan uses those timeless truths to bait a religious hook. While this explanation provides a spiritual reason for why parallels exist, it doesn't have a lot of explanatory power. However, when caricaturized, the view can be misconstrued to hold that the only purpose of parallels is to deceive or draw people from Christianity. And that contention is a debatable proposition at best. Number three, parallels are post-biblical. This is the idea that parallels are the result of borrowing from the Bible, not the reverse. Most of the time, when discussed, it's presented as a kind of straw man. Again, few people claim this as a complete explanation for the issue of parallels. But again, sometimes it does explain some apparent parallels. An example of this is when it is claimed that Christianity appropriated the date of Christmas from the Sol Invictus cult. Now, the earliest traces of the Sol Invictus cult date to 158 AD, and it wasn't until AD 274 that Roman Emperor Aurelian made the festival of Sol Invictus on December 25th, and that was done to compete with Christianity. So here we have a parallel that is actually post-biblical. But again, this explanation in no way covers all parallels. Now, before going much further, we need to discuss the topic of plagiarism. This is an accusation often leveled against the Bible. That is, quote, the Bible is a ripoff of paganism, plagiarizing past sources and myths, and therefore the Bible is pagan, end quote. However, we must be cognizant that the notion of plagiarism is an anachronism. It depends on the idea that authors had moral and property rights over their writing. That idea was not coined until the late 1st century AD, and did not gain traction for a couple hundred years after that. As such, the idea of plagiarism is for the most part a post-biblical innovation. As such, the charge that the Bible uses plagiarism can no more be leveled against its authors than the crime of computer fraud could be leveled against Napoleon Bonaparte. However, the term ripoff is a different and lesser accusation. A ripoff is when someone steals someone else's ideas or words without transformation. A text that is often cited as being ripped off is Psalm 104, which appears to have been inspired by the Hymn of the Aten. However, even if the psalm had been inspired by the hymn, the text has clearly undergone a lot of transformation, making it appropriate for monotheistic worship. Psalm 104 contains no references to the sun god, the Aten, and the pantheistic undertones found in the Hymn of the Aten are completely absent. Mark S. Smith commented on Psalm 104 in regards to the Hymn of the Aten as follows, quote, despite enduring support for the comparison of the two texts, enthusiasm for even indirect influence has been tempered in recent decades. In some quarters, the argument for any form of influence is simply rejected outright, end quote. Mark S. Smith, God in Translation, 2010, page 70. So then, even if symbols or texts are borrowed from pagan sources, they can undergo transformation that renders them appropriate for monotheistic audiences. Once that transformation occurs, the symbols are no longer used for pagan worship, but Yahweh worship. So then, while the three apologetic explanations cover many of the parallels, there are times when the Bible interacts with non-biblical sources. And there are even times when the Bible quotes from non-biblical texts. Those instances are not covered by the three common apologetic explanations. And the Bible uses non-biblical sources for a variety of reasons. Sometimes the Bible does it to critique, sometimes to illustrate, sometimes to repurpose, sometimes as dialectic, and even sometimes to affirm a common truth. This then raises the question, how does God, who is wholly other, that is, unlike man, communicate with mankind in an understandable way? God could use concepts and words that are completely new to the Bronze Age people. But then, how would they understand what was being said? For example, God could have said to the Israelites, gas up a Honda Civic and drive it to Tel Aviv. And the Israelites would have replied, what is gas up? What's Honda? What's a Civic? What's drive? And what's Tel Aviv? Nothing in that sentence would have been understandable to a Bronze Age person. Bronze Age people had a magical worldview. They were pastoralists who believed in the spirit world, magic, and the afterlife. They intuitively understood sacred space, ritual purity, theological localism, and religious iconography. We live in an Enlightenment world of science, engineering, and accounting. The two worlds, the world of the 21st century and the world of the late Bronze Age, are completely different from each other. So God would have to have communicated to a Bronze Age people in Bronze Age terms. So then, now we have a fourth explanation for why non-biblical parallels are in the Bible. And that is, ideas have to be taken from surrounding cultures to support what the biblical author is saying. And to that extent, the Bible is like other written books. A book with no citations is unmoored from reality. A book with just one citation is plagiarized. A book with many citations is well researched and properly moored to the reality of its subject. The Bible contains many parallels that are found in Canaanite, Egyptian, Assyrian, Persian, Greek, and Roman literature and culture. These references establish the subject matter to something outside of itself. This is why the biblical authors quote Apocrypha, Greek philosophers, and even pagan sources. Therefore, just like when the seal of Hezekiah, which has an Egyptian Wadjet solar disk and two ankhs, which are undoubtedly Egyptian religious symbols, these symbols were repurposed for Yahweh worship. Thereby, through repurposing, the formerly religious symbolism becomes redeemed. This is a part of Yahweh worship, where God reconciles all to himself by using aspects of the surrounding culture. This is how God condescended to mankind. God did not make man reach up to him by insisting man had a perfect understanding of the divine first. I mean, that wouldn't even be reasonable for God to expect of mankind. Instead, God took aspects of the culture, appropriated symbols from that culture, and flipped those symbols on their heads in order to guide mankind to a new understanding of who he is. In conclusion, the biblical scriptures are not just religious texts. They are the literary output of a culture. Biblical and non-biblical texts are literature. No literature arises from a vacuum. The idea that the words of the Bible are a de novo text is a myth. Likewise, the idea that the Bible is pagan is also a myth. The truth lies in between the extremes. All literature, and that includes religious literature, comes out of a pool of ideas, and this was noted by Christopher Partridge. Religion adds to the pool of ideas, and then takes some ideas out for its own purposes. So anyway, I hope you found that helpful and interesting. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.